Okay, so a bit of a health warning before we get into this topic of mental health. I'm going to be talking in this tutorial about some things that are quite grave and quite serious. We are going to talk a little bit about things like self-harm and suicide, completely sensitively, but of course I just wanted to make you aware of that before we get into this, just so you're aware. Okay, so just a bit of a warning on that one. The first thing I want to do, guys, is I want to introduce you to some mental health stats for Northern Ireland. Okay, so if I bring this image in for a second, obviously what we've got here is we have some graphical imagery, and the point I want to sort of spell out to you here is that this effectively is the percentage of people showing signs of some kind of possible mental health problem. Okay, and what you'll sort of notice there is that we've got a peak in kind of the middle years. That was meant to be a dark colour. Bear with me a second. We've got a bit of a peak. I'm not sure why I can't change colour. We've got a bit of a peak in this sort of middle years here, where this is particularly high at this stage of life. But also we've got a real spike here of kind of men, sort of between 25 and 34. That's really, really significant. The other thing I would say is that in this category here, so from 35 up to 54, women seem to be presenting more challenges with regard to mental health than men, according to these statistics, which are from 2014-15, reported in 2016. I'm recording this in 2020. These were the most recent stats that were available. So we've got some interesting trends here. But again, you know, we have a higher peak for men at the 25 to 34, and then we have a high peak 55 to 64 for men. Now, if we bring in this next image, this is actually quite an interesting one, because what we've got here, this is the cost of medication or prescription of medication for antidepressant, or I guess for depressive type conditions. And what we're seeing here is per kind of capita in England, for example, the average person is utilising £5 worth, but in Northern Ireland we've got a consistently higher £8.61 in 2013. So basically more antidepressants are being used in Northern Ireland than in England, Scotland or Wales. Okay, so now that could mean that there's more ill health. It could mean that it's more typically prescribed. There could be various reasons, but there's a significant difference here, and the difference is consistent across these 4 years of measurement. So something's going on there. Let's take things a little bit further. Let's have a look. And this I mentioned about things being a bit kind of grave. This is what we would call the suicide rate per 100,000 of population. And the point I would make on this one, I mean, we could make numerous inferences. First of all, we could say that what we're seeing here quite clearly is that men tend to end their own lives in greater proportions than women do. But I think what we'd sort of say more generally is that the trend is up, and even with this lower level, the trend is up for women as well. So there seems to be we've got this kind of upwards trend here. I don't want to draw on that because it's not accurate, but you see we've got this kind of upward trends. I guess what you could also argue is it's been stable since 2005. So maybe that's just something to be aware of. Okay, so that's not an interesting statistic in and of itself. And finally, guys, if we look at this one, this is it's an interesting statistic because basically at this end of the x-axis here, this is people who if I simplify, effectively are poorer, and down here they are wealthier. Okay, and what we're seeing here is that basically as people become people who are in poorer conditions, the tendency for suicide is higher. Okay, now that's of course an interesting statistic to start to consider. Well, what's the relationship between suicide and socioeconomic status? Now I want to be crystal clear, guys. I consider my job today to be reporting that data to you. I do not see myself as an expert on these things. I'm simply reporting those and identifying some trends with you. What I would like to take you through in a bit more detail, though, folks, is I'd like to talk to you about the impact of positive mental health. And of course we've got certain things that we've just seen there, but what is the impact of positive mental health? What could we talk about here? I want to talk to you about a few things. So people with positive mental health, they cope well with challenge. Okay, so if life can be hard at times, let's be honest. And whether you're going through exams or whether you're going through a house move or someone's poorly, or life can be stressful, right? And people with positive mental health, one of the signs that we can identify that is they cope well with those challenges. Now, obviously, if something's very grave, it's going to obviously impact on people. There's no question about that. That's normal. But we could describe people with positive mental health as more resilient, or they experience resilience. They can keep going in difficult circumstances. The other thing is that they function well with others. Okay, so people showing positive mental health will be able to work well with other people. They engage socially effectively, and they'll be accepted in those environments. And then the way they present will be accepted as well. They'll also develop coping skills for life, and we're going to look at some of those factors either later on in this tutorial or in a separate one. Okay, so what coping skills might actually be, but we'd also expect to see with people with positive mental health that they can effectively manage emotions. Okay, so even if they're having a bad day or a bad time or a bad week or bad month, they can manage the impact of that on them. Okay, their emotions are not dramatically up and down. Now that will vary from person to person. I'll give you an insight. I'm not talking about this as a mental health issue, but I am a very undulating person in my mood, in my temperament. Okay, and that of course is going to be different for different people. My partner Marta, for example, is extremely consistent, and so on and so on. So there's people are different, but we're talking about this being the difference between well and unwell, I suppose. This is a really interesting statement. Okay. People with good mental health will have an honest self-regard. That's really interesting, isn't it? They'll be able to look at themselves honestly, and they'll have an honest, positive self-esteem, not inflated, not arrogant, not something that they're not, or expecting to be something they're not, but an honest self-regard, and therefore they see themselves with balance. And this one I'll finish off with here. This is what we'd call an accurate. People with good mental health will have an accurate and realistic view of the world. Okay, view of the world. And I think that again is a really interesting one, right? The capacity to see the world, all of its positives and negatives, and be able to have a sort of an honest impression of what that is. Now, what we're going to do to finish this one off is we're going to look at sort of the flip side of this particular coin, and we're going to look here at consequences of poor mental health. Okay, so if someone is experiencing poor mental health, so consequences of poor mental health, what is the likely outcome? I mean, obviously it will vary from person to person, clearly, but what might be some of the things that we see? And of course, you're going to see them related to what we've just talked about. But here's one example. Someone who's suffering poor mental health, let me redo that. They will likely be also experiencing, or quite possibly experiencing, poor physical health. They seem to come in combination. There's a few examples. We're going to broaden that out in a few moments' time. They may develop what's called a sedentary lifestyle. A sedentary lifestyle. Remember, sedentary lifestyle refers to someone who spends too much of their life sitting or lying down. Of course, if someone's experiencing something like depression, for example, they may sort of revert to being kind of isolated and quiet and still. And I don't know, I'm being a bit cliche, but you get the idea. They're going to have a decrease in motivation for life challenges and for the things that they need to do. So the motivation level of an individual is going to reduce, which of course can cause issues. And some people will experience a loss of appetite. So people who are suffering poor mental health may well suffer a loss of appetite or develop what's called, or what we might describe as, poor nutrition. So what you might find there is that someone might spend the majority of the day not eating, for example, and then it comes to like an evening time, for example, or late at night, and then they sort of like need to consume those calories, and they develop a poor, unbalanced relationship with food. I don't want to be specific, but as a general picture. People suffering poor mental health will also have difficulty dealing with trauma. Okay, that's dealing, believe it or not. So people who are less well mentally, if something unpleasant happens, a bereavement, something like that, a breakdown of a relationship, someone becomes poorly, they're going to suffer that much more because of the kind of the lack of balance that exists more generally. I'm trying to get my words sort of balanced itself. And my last one, guys, is that they're going to have high stress levels. Now, stress is an interesting one because you might think, well, it's a psychological thing, it's in the mind. The problem with stress is it causes the ongoing release of adrenaline, and that adrenaline can cause cardiac problems because, of course, adrenaline, amongst other things, acts directly on the heart, the sinoatrial node, like the pacemaker of the heart, and it can actually do some damage if this is over time, okay? And we're talking about this over time. So people who suffer stress, that's what we're talking about, that ongoing adrenaline release that causes that problem. Thanks.